You are not looking for happiness, not the loud kind anyway. What you actually want is quieter than that, and a philosopher who spent his life on the edge of Athens gave it an exact name more than 2,000 years ago. If you had to guess what the word epicurean means, you would probably land somewhere near indulgence. A dictionary will confirm the instinct. Fond of or adapted to luxury or indulgence in sensual pleasures is one definition, having luxurious tastes or habits, especially in eating and drinking. The word has drifted over centuries of use towards something close to its own opposite. Epicurean now commonly means devotion to refined, sensuous enjoyment, especially of good food and drink. Epicurus, the man the word is named for, would not have recognized the description, and he left behind enough of his own writing that we do not have to guess at his objection. Epicurus taught in Athens in the late 4th and early 3rd centuries before the Common Era, and one of his most complete surviving works is a letter to a student named Menoeceus. Pleasure is our first and kindred good, he tells him in Robert Drew Hicks's translation. It is the starting point of every choice and of every aversion. Taken alone, that sentence sounds exactly like the doctrine the dictionary describes. It is not, and the rest of the letter explains why. Free from pain and fear, and when once we have attained all this, the tempest of the soul is laid. Read that twice. The goal was never more pleasure stacked on more pleasure. The goal was the absence of a specific weather system in the mind, and once that tempest is gone, there is nowhere further to travel. By pleasure, he clarifies elsewhere in the same letter, we mean the absence of pain in the body and of trouble in the soul. Not a sensation to chase, a condition to arrive at and then simply occupy. This is exactly where the popular meaning of the word gets it backward. There was a rival school active in Epicurus's own philosophy summarizes their position, advocated increasing desires and seeking ever new ways of gratifying them. Chase pleasure by continually escalating what you chase. Epicurus studied that approach and rejected it on its own terms. Such pleasures, the encyclopedia notes, are necessarily accompanied by distress, for they depend upon a lack that is painful. You cannot want a bigger version of something without first manufacturing the very lack that makes the bigger version feel urgent. The strategy does not end appetite. It regenerates a fresh one every time the last is satisfied, and the popular idea of an Epicurean life is, ironically, closer to the Sarnaic one Epicurus spent his career arguing against. What he proposed instead had a specific name, katastematic pleasure. In the encyclopedia's phrasing, it is a state rather than a process, the pleasure that accompanies well-being as such, not the spike of getting something you wanted. The condition of no longer wanting, held quietly in the background, whether or not anything interesting happens to be occurring to you at the moment. The Greek word for that condition is ataraxia. At the root, it means a mind without turbulence, nothing currently being stirred. That is the word this channel takes its name from, and everything else in this episode is really one long unpacking of what stands underneath it. Epicurus was specific about how a person actually gets there, and the specificity is where his reputation as a hedonist collapses on contact with his own words. In the letter to Menoeceus, he lays out a classification. Of desires, he writes, some are natural, others are groundless, and of the natural, some are necessary as well as natural, and some natural only. 3 categories, not one. Wanting water when you are thirsty is natural and necessary. Wanting an elaborate meal when a plain one would satisfy you is natural but not necessary. Wanting fame or a particular brand of anything belongs to neither category. It is groundless, manufactured without a floor under it. His Principal Doctrines return to the same sorting from another angle. The limit of great pleasures, he wrote, is the removal of everything which can give pain, not their multiplication. The ceiling is set by absence, by what has stopped hurting, not by how much more gets piled on top once it has. And once that ceiling is reached, more does not add height. Pleasure in the flesh is not increased, he wrote, when once the pain arising from want is removed. It is only diversified. A second serving does not make you more full. It only changes the flavor of a satisfaction you already had. One of his doctrines is the one people usually flinch at, because on first read it sounds like a loophole for exactly the excess he is arguing against. If those things which make the pleasures of debauched men, he wrote, put an end to the fears of the mind, and to those which arise about the heavenly bodies in death and pain, and if they taught us what ought to be the limit of our desires, we should have no pretense for blaming those who wholly devote themselves to pleasure. Notice the shape of the sentence. It is entirely conditional. If indulgence actually delivered freedom from fear and taught its own limit, there would be no argument left against it. So it never resolves the fear it was supposedly distracting from. The line is not a loophole. It is a diagnosis of why the loophole never closes for the people trying to live inside it. He was no ascetic about this either. The flesh, he wrote in one of the sayings preserved from his school in Peter St. Andre's translation, cries out to not be hungry, not be thirsty, not be cold. Anyone who has these things and who is confident of continuing to have them can rival the gods for happiness. That is a strikingly low bar, deliberately so. Warmth, food, drink, and the reasonable expectation of keeping them. Everything people spend their lives chasing past that point adds far less than advertised. One will not banish emotional disturbance, he wrote elsewhere, or arrive at significant joy through great wealth, fame, celebrity, or anything else which is a result of vague and indefinite causes. Nothing is enough, he wrote in a third saying, to one for whom enough is very little. The object was rarely the actual problem. A mind that is never defined enough will treat every arrival as a new departure. He even left behind something close to a working diagnostic. Ask this question of every desire, he wrote. What will happen to me if the object of desire is achieved, and what if not? Run it against the last thing you wanted badly. If the honest answer is that very little changes either way, the desire was mostly whether passing through. If the answer is that something real is genuinely at stake, the desire has a floor under it, and belongs in the natural and necessary column rather than the other two. Death sits inside the same architecture, and Epicurus addressed it head-on, because a mind afraid of its own end cannot be still no matter how carefully it has sorted its other desires. Death, he wrote, the most awful of evils is nothing to us, seeing that when we are, death is not come, and when death is come, we are not. It is not comforting in the way people usually want comfort to feel. It is closer to a logical observation. The thing feared and the person doing. He who has a clear and certain understanding of these things, he concluded, will direct every preference and aversion toward securing health of body and tranquility of mind, seeing that this is the sum and end of a happy life. Modern psychology arrived at a description of the trap Epicurus was arguing against, though from an entirely different direction and roughly 23 centuries later. In 1971, the psychologists Brickman and Campbell published a paper called Hedonic Relativism and Planning the Good Society. The term that came out of it, the hedonic treadmill, describes the conjecture that humans quickly return to a relatively stable level of happiness despite major positive or negative events or life changes. The process is conceptualized as a treadmill, since no matter how hard one tries to be happier, one remains in the same place. The larger house, the promotion, the upgrade you were sure would finally be enough. Within a stretch of time that surprises almost everyone who lives through it, the new baseline settles into feeling exactly as ordinary as the old one did. The Cyrenaic strategy Epicurus argued against and the treadmill two psychologists described in the 20th century are the same mechanism, seen from two different centuries, described in two entirely different vocabularies. What Epicurus offers that the treadmill description alone does not is a way to actually step off it. Not more effort spent at the same game, running faster toward a ceiling that keeps rising to meet you. A different definition of enough, arrived at deliberately, examined honestly, and then genuinely believed, rather than quietly revised upward every single time it gets reached. The word the popular imagination attached to his name describes almost exactly the trap he spent his life diagnosing. The word he would have chosen for what he was actually after is quieter, considerably older, and a great deal harder to put on a label. Ataraxia, not the absence of feeling, the absence of turbulence, the tempest laid and nothing rushing in behind it to take up the noise. None of this requires renouncing anything. What it actually asks for is smaller and more available than the philosophy might suggest, noticing the moment a preference quietly promotes itself to an emergency, and asking plainly which of the three categories it really belongs to. It is choosing an evening with 2 or 3 people who actually know you over a wider audience you happen to be performing for. It is treating an hour with nothing scheduled in it not as time you failed to use, but as the exact thing the rest of the effort was supposedly buying in the first place. None of it requires bread and water. It requires knowing, specifically, which disturbance you are still carrying out of habit and which one you stopped, a long time ago, actually needing. If you have ever sat, even briefly, with a version of enough that you actually believed, the comments are open for what that felt like. The next video stays with these same ideas from a different angle entirely, the deliberate case for doing less, and what an old philosophical tradition thought that discipline was actually for.